Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 1, Halacha 1 in the Art Scroll on 1A1. This will be an 8-part shiur. This is part 1 of the shiur. The length of Halacha 1 is very long. The Mishnah is a Mishnah that everybody should know about. It begins with a list of people who are not qualified to separate out Truma. And the reason everybody should know about it is because it deals with Kavanah, it deals with intent, and it deals with action. And also you should be aware of it because one of the critiques of Judaism, particularly by Christian missionaries, is they will distort Jewish law and say that minors can be married in Jewish law. The Mishnah is going to say that the 5 individuals may not separate out Truma. Now, the act of separating it out Truma is that you are making something kodesh with a declaration and with Kavanah and with an act that is pulling one thing from another. It is making a separation. And just like how Hashem made a separation in the 6 days, where he's separating, light from dark and separating out the waters and the heavens and the earth. Well, we also are making a separation. We are taking a pile of grain or other things like wine or oil, olive oil, and we are taking one part with a declaration and intention and action and physically separating it out and saying that this part here is secular and ordinary and hulin. That's what hulin is. And we are taking this part here and declaring it as Truma Gedola. Now, that is a very deep concept. There is Kavanah here. A lot of the academics will say that, there's no Kavanah in Judaism. That's not true. This Mishnah dispels that. Now, that's the baby playing in the background, and I'm going to do the shiur anyway. So, the Mishnah says the 5 individuals may not separate out Truma, and if they did separate Truma, their Truma is not a valid Truma. What does that mean? What happens if you have a not valid Truma? Well, it didn't get endowed with sanctity, and so both this portion and that portion still has tevel in it, and you have to separate it out again. Now, the idea is that we're separating out the Truma Gedola. That's going to be what releases most of this from having tevel. The main part of the grain pile that you had when you take out the Truma Gedola doesn't have tevel in it, but the portion that's given to the Levi has a small amount of tevel in it. The Meiser Rishon has to have the Truma Meiser, where the Levi now gives a portion to the Goan, and that releases his portion from having tevel in it. More can be seen about this in Masechet Demai. So the gemara, the Mishnah says that, here's the list, a deaf person. Now, when we're talking about a deaf person, we're going to ultimately be talking about a deaf mute, somebody who can neither hear nor speak. There is such a thing, by the way. And it's going to look like, a deaf person, and why is it just a deaf person who can't hear? Well, there is a spoken component to it, right? You are speaking when you are separating out the Truma. So what about the next part? And by the way, each of these parts is not like the other. There's a little bit different parts with each of these in this list. So this deaf mute is not able to do it. Why? Because they're not able to speak the declaration, nor can they hear it. The next one is going to be a deranged person. This is going to be an insane person who really can't tell the difference even between day and night. They're so out of it. And what is that going to be? Well, how does this person have any kind of intention or kavanah? The next one is going to be really very interesting. This is the minor. This is somebody who does not just doesn't have the understanding of the act that he's doing or she's doing. So, like my baby who's Aaron Udaleb, who is 1 year old, how could he separate out Truma, right? How could he buy something? How could he make a contract? How could he declare something? He's a baby, doesn't have understanding. And then it says, one who separates Truma from that which is not his. In other words, we're going to see later on, it's going to be your grain. It has to be from your grain. So if somebody else has property that's not theirs and they try to separate out Truma, did they separate anything out? No, it's not theirs. It doesn't fill the qualification of your Truma. And finally, an idol worshiper. And so it says, finally, if an idol worshiper separates out Truma from the produce of a Jew, even with the Jew's consent, their Truma is not valid Truma. This, by the way, as we covered in Demai, really gets into the areas of Jewish law for what parts of the land has Kedusha and doesn't have Kedusha, because if non-Jews own the land or are producing on the land, are you going to be liable to take out tithes from that produce, right? So if you have a farm that's always been in the hand of non-Jews, and now they're growing grain on it, and it's going to be a day when it doesn't have sanctity, the land doesn't have sanctity, do you have to separate out tithes from that? Do you have to even separate out demai for that? So the idea is that the non-Jew is not commanded regarding Truma. This is going to be something just for the statement that says that their Truma is not valid Truma. So the Mishnah goes on to the law of a deaf person. The Mishnah says that a deaf person who can speak but cannot hear, that they may not separate Truma initially, but if he did separate Truma's valid Truma after the fact. And the deaf person that the sages spoke about in all these places, says the Mishnah, including, by the way, the beginning, is going to be somebody who's incompetent. That's going to be defined as somebody who can neither hear nor speak. That is a 100% deaf mute. Why? Because as we heard before, this is somebody who can't say the designation, and he can't hear the designation being made, even if he's saying it. And that's going to be a problem. So the Tanakama, the Mishnah is basically going to be saying that if you had a deaf person who could hear, but he can speak, so he's speaking the designation, but he's not hearing his own designation, they're saying you shouldn't do it, but it's valid after the fact. Now, the Tanakama is going to invalidate the Truma that is separated by a minor, but there's a dissent to that in this Mishnah, and the Mishnah says regarding a minor who has grown 2 hairs that are going to be the signs, by the way, of adulthood, that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that his Truma is a valid Truma. And the idea is that from the Shenis Eliyahu, that Rabbi Yehuda is holding that a minor of any age who's intelligent enough to separate out Truma. And basically he's disputing the Tanakama, who disqualifies a minor from separating out Truma. So Rabbi Yehuda states that only the minor's Truma is valid, and it's meaning that after the fact we're going to recognize it as a valid Truma, but he concludes that a minor really should not be separating out Truma. The question that the nuance that Rabbi Yehuda is making is if he did it, was it valid? That's the distinction. But everybody agrees you shouldn't be separating out Truma, Mr. Aaron Udaleb. So Rabbi Yehuda says his Truma is valid. By the way, that's not the position of the Tanakama. Tanakama is saying that the Truma separated out by minors is not valid. And Rabbi Yossi says that if a minor separates Truma before he reaches the age of vows. Now, the idea here is that the ages are a little bit different between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. And so the age of vows is going to be the year that comes before adulthood. In other words, that for a man, the age of adulthood is 13. This is going to be in the 12th year. And for a female, it's going to be in the 12th birthday, and then it's going to be the 11th birthday. So his timing is a little bit different than Rabbi Yuda's timing, and it's called this age of vows because a neder can be made by minors, and at this age it can be binding because, and by the way, it has to be in a case where even if it's made at this age, the person has to understand the nature of the vows. So even if the boy is, say, 12, but doesn't understand the nature of the vow, it's not a valid vow. And so Rabbi Yossi is basically talking about saying that, it's a generality, but again, you have to look on a case-by-case basis to make sure that they understand what they are saying. That's going to be the idea. In other words, they can't make this separation or an acquisition or something like that without having kavanah, without having intention or understanding of what they're doing. Now, this is a acquisition in a way. In other words, you are taking your hulin pile that contains some tevel in it. You are separating out a portion that goes to the Kohen, and then the portion that you have left stays with you, and then of course you have to take out the remaining tithes. You have to take out, after the Truma Gedola, you have to take out your Meiser Rishon, which goes to the Levi. You have to take out the Meiser Sheni or Meiser Ini for yourself. And if you're dealing with bread, you have to take out the challah. So Rabbi Yossi says that in this Mishnah that if the minor separates Truma before he reaches the age of vows, that his Truma is not valid Truma, and that's Aaron Yudah Leib saying challah, because that is one of the tithes, but only with bread. And the Mishnah says, but if he separates it after he has reached the age of vows, his Truma is valid Truma. Now, separating Truma is going to be similar to a neder vow. That's the idea that Rabbi Yossi says, in that the designated portion that's endowed with Truma sanctity is going to be a result of a verbal declaration. And Rashi says in Nida 46b that just as an item that is subject to a neder vow becomes prohibited as a result of a verbal declaration, so too does this. So in other words, if you can designate something verbally and put it into a different category, like in a vow you can make something prohibited to yourself. So the idea here is that both are occurring with verbal declarations, and it is possible, says the Rambam, to annul a Truma declaration in the same way that it's possible to annul a vow. And that's in Rambam Hilchos Terumos 417. But the idea here is that Rabbi Yossi's holding that just as a 12-year-old boy or 11-year-old girl can affect a vow, so too he can affect Truma. However, just like with the vows, this is only done if the minor understands the nature of the Truma designation, and also a minor younger than that cannot affect the Truma designation, according to Rabbi Yossi. But again, they have to at least understand it. So the 12-year-old has to understand what he did. If he doesn't, it's not binding. It's not enough to just say that's the number and that's that and move on. Now, the Gemara is going to start to analyze the 5 individuals who may not separate out Truma. And the Gemara says a scriptural source for these exclusions. In other words, where do we know this from? So in the Gemara that's coming up, there's a lot of Rishonim that explain that Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman is going to understand this Gemara and this verse in the Torah like how Rabbi Shimon does. Now, the sages are going to be looking at this verse as an asmata and be saying that this is how we learn it, but that it's not a Doraita thing. And Rabbi Shimon, and perhaps, as many Rishonim say, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman, who's coming up, is going to understand, according to Rabbi Shimon, and say that no, the requirement to separate out Truma is only on the Jew, and that is Doraita, and this is going to be the source. And that's what we're dealing with. So the Gemara wants to know a source for these exclusions, that the 5 individuals may not separate out Truma. And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman derive the disqualification of all five of them from here in the following verse, where it says over in Exodus 25:2, it says, "Speak to the children of Israel and let them take for me a truma." By the way, truma means a portion. And it continues, says, "From every man whose heart motivates him shall you take my truma." Now, this verse is stated in the context of accepting contributions to build the Mishkan. And although this verse has it where truma is talking about a donated portion, the use of truma here is linking the passage to that of actual truma. And the Rosh Cirilio is going to say that, really what this is talking about is the people who are, excluded by this verse, would they be able to contribute toward the construction of the Mishkan? And are they also going to be excluded from separating out truma or other tithes? So the sages are going to be holding that this is an asmata between this and that, and Rabbi Shimon is going to be saying that no, this is actually deraita, that only the children of Israel can separate out truma, as it says here. Now, the Gemara continues and says the phrase "children of Israel" comes to exclude the idol worshiper. Now, idol worshippers are excluded from contributing toward the construction of the Mishkan, and by extending this to the context of truma, we're learning that an idol worshiper also can't separate out truma from the Jews' portion. However, as we are going to see in the Mishnah in the second Terumos in 3:5, that an idol worshiper actually can separate out truma from his own portion. And again, the reason that the non-Jew can't separate, even if he's the agent of the Jew can't separate for the agent of the non-Jew, is because this truma and that truma are dissimilar. When a Jew separates out truma, then the truma he takes out has a different level of kedusha where it's subject to 1/5 penalty for being eaten, and that doesn't apply for the non-Jew. So a kohen, if he's getting from a Jew or non-Jew, is going to be treating it a little bit differently. It's not exactly the same. And so the phrase where it says "for every man" in that verse is going to talk about the minor, says the Gemara. In other words, the man is teaching that only adults are qualified to give toward the construction of the Mishkan, not a minor. And why would that be? Well, Rabbi Yudah is going to consider minors fit to designate truma, but Rabbi Yossi is going to consider minors fit once they reach the age of vows, and the Tanakama is going to be saying that actually no, minors really can't be separating out truma unless they have actual they have actual understanding. So perhaps you have somebody that's in bar mitzvah training, maybe they're 12 years old. Well, that's going to be a different case where that person's under guidance and that type of education. And so the idea here is that when it's talking about from every man, it's excluding a minor, that's somebody who doesn't have the intellectual, mental understanding or capability. And the Gemara continues and says the phrase "whose heart motivates him" excludes a deaf, mute, and a deranged person. So the words "whose heart motivates him" teaches that only those possessing a heart with a mature intellect are going to be qualified to donate items to the Mishkan, and this excludes the deaf mute who has a lack of a clear understanding, and the same is going to go for a deranged person. And so these are not going to be qualified to separate out truma. And as a rule, minors are considered mentally incompetent, like the deaf mute or the deranged person. And the idea is that if their heart motivates them, they're not qualified because they can't make a kinyan, they can't separate things. So again, when you're making a vow to sanctify something, it takes understanding, it takes Kavanah. And that's one of the other key ideas about chapter 1, Halacha 1, and also what's going on in the first part of this year, is that you really have to have Kavanah when you're separating that out. Now, there's a lot of academics that say, well, Judaism doesn't really have Kavanah, and it was made up later by the rabbis. But as you can see in chapter 1, and how both the sages and Rabbi Shimon are going through to understand this. When you're separating out Truma with that vow, that there has to be some level of understanding. Now, there's a disagreement between Rabbi Yudah, Rabbi Yosef, and the sages on exactly when that point is, but that person at some point has to have understanding, otherwise it's not a valid separation. They have to be able to have Kavanah to do it. You can't just do it. And we see this with other mitzvahs as well, that there has to be Kavanah, for instance, in a lot of the offerings. When you're actually going to designate any of the other offerings in the temple, you're supposed to be doing it with Kavanah, and in some of those offerings, they're not valid if the Kavanah wasn't there. The Gemara is going to continue and say that the opening phrase from the next verse, this is going to be in Exodus 25:3, says that this is the Truma and you shall take from them, and it excludes, says the Gemara, one who separates a portion from that which is not his. So since Scripture is calling these portions that are donated to the Mishkan Truma, we can infer that the 5 individuals excluded from donating toward the construction of the Mishkan are also excluded from separating out Truma. Now, the idea is that a deaf, mute, and a deranged person are going to be excluded from separating out Truma on the basis of the verse where it says whose heart motivates him. Why? Because they're assumed to lack the mental competence, that's going to be what the heart is over here, to properly designate Truma. And the Gemara questions this assumption. It says, but let their action of separating Truma from the Truma portion from the rest of the produce demonstrate the validity of the intention to perform a proper Truma designation. So, in other words, and this comes up, by the way, in Bavli and Chulin 13a, so even though these individuals, this class of individuals, are, for the most part, not going to be regarded as mentally competent, what happens if they actually did so? In other words, what happens if they're looking like they're acting intelligently and they actually separated it? Maybe we should say that they had Kavanah in doing it. Maybe we should recognize it. That's really where we're going with this. So the Gemara is going to cite a basis for this argument. It's going to say we learned in a Mishnah in regards to the law of preparing foodstuffs for Tuma that if a deaf mute or a deranged person or a minor brought up fruits to the roof and they became moistened by dew, even though he intended that dew should fall on them, those fruits are not subject to the scriptural rule where it says if water is placed on them. In other words, it does not become susceptible to tuma because they are not deemed to have been moistened with intent. So the idea, says Rashi, is that the intention of the deaf mute or the deranged person or the minor is not meaningful in regards to affecting hechsher. Again, this is coming up in Chulin 13a, and that's the Rashi note. So the idea is that, if the intent of any of these 3 classes of individuals is going to be legally effective, only when, supported by an action, then maybe that action shows intent. And, certainly the deaf mute can't articulate anything, but maybe they did something in a way that showed that they have intent. That's what we're really getting at. So the Gemara is going to be saying that, this is so because these incompetents have only legally significant action, but they do not have legally significant intention. In other words, that they're separating out the idea of a legal action versus an action that's taken with intention. So the idea is that, if somebody went ahead and trached something up, they took action, that's going to be legally significant action, even if they did it without the understanding of doing so. So that's going to be an idea for that. So, like, for instance, if you have children that are playing with dough and there's something there that's going to be tameh, then the question is, well, if it's all in one area and, they don't have intention, but if they're, you can see that perhaps they were putting this tameh thing together with the dough, is that dough going to be considered to be tameh? And it's going to turn out that, if it's going to be in likelihood that the kid was playing with it, even if you can't see him actually doing it, and it's all right there in the same area, you're going to assume that he did it. And that's, again, if they're like playing with the things are, together. So that's going to be a legally significant act, even though he didn't have Kavanah to make it Tameh, it's still going to be Tameh. So again, it's trying to separate out this idea of legally significant acts that can be done even if somebody doesn't have intention to do it. And the Gemara says that we analyzed a Mishnah like this, where it says, what is an action of theirs that would be legally significant in regard to making food susceptible to Truma? And Rabbi Huna said, to explain what would be the separation between legally significant acts that might not have any kavanah to it, the Mishnah alludes to a case where the deaf-mute, the deranged person, or the minor holds the fruit up in the dew so that they can become moist. Now, this action demonstrates that the deaf-mute or the deranged person or the minor maybe really does intend for the fruit to become wet, which in turn, by the way, will make it susceptible to Truma. So we see that when there's an intention of one of these individuals, and that's going to be supported by an action, that intention is going to be regarded as legally significant. But we're going to learn something else. It's going to also say that when we learned in another Mishnah regarding the preparation of Truma, that if a deaf person or a deranged person or a minor brought an animal down to the river, even though he intended that its feet should be rinsed, the waters on its feet are not subject to the scriptural rule of if water is placed. In other words, they do not have the capacity to render foods susceptible to Truma. Why? Because they are not deemed to have become detached from the river with intent. And they didn't make the intention known. So the Gemara says that this is because these incompetents have only legally significant action, but they do not have legally significant action with intent. And the idea is that the Mishnah is teaching that the waters on the animal's feet do not have the capacity to affect hechsher when it was led into the river by a mentally incompetent person. And the water in its mouth, however, does have the capacity to affect hechsher. And this is because his act of leading the animal down to the river demonstrates his intention that it should drink from the river. And it's on this basis for defining the water on the outside of the mouth as having been detached with satisfaction. In other words, this action does not demonstrate his intention was for the feet to be rinsed. So over there, for his feet, his intention over there on that part would be ineffective, but over there on his mouth, where he clearly led the animal over there to drink the water, that whatever saliva or water or whatever moisture from the mouth would be touching the other water, that would be where that part can make something tameh. So the Gemara says we analyze this Mishnah like this and says, what is an action of theirs that would be legally significant in regard to making the waters that we were considering to be detached with intent? Rabbi Huna says that the Mishnah alludes to a case where he rubs the feet of the animals in water. Why? Because now he's demonstrated that he took them to the water to wash the feet. He didn't take them to the water for the animal to drink. And if that was the case, then only the feet would be subject, or the mouth would be subject. But now over here, you see he's washing the feet, that he took this action with the intent that it should be supported by the intent to wash the feet. And that's why the feet of the animal should be regarded rather than the mouth. So the Gemara is going to conclude a question. It's going to say, let us say also that same thing here in our Mishnah's case, that when the mentally incompetent individual is going to physically separate a Truma portion from the rest of the produce, let their action demonstrate perhaps the validity of their intent to perform a proper Truma designation. So the fact that they're going and separating out a portion, maybe it means that they really had intent to do it. Gemara answers, Rabbi Shmuel cited Rabbi Abahu, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Zera says in the name of the rabbis, that the verse states, and your Truma shall be reckoned to you. This, by the way, is in Numbers 18:27. The verse in the entirety reads where it says, and your Truma shall be reckoned to you like the grain from the threshing floor and like the wine of the winepress. And this verse is actually talking about Truma Meiser. It's teaching that has the same laws of Truma Gedola. In other words, grain from the threshing floor or wine from the winepress. And since the Gemara is deriving the laws of Truma Gedola from this verse, then all things called Truma are going to be linked to one another, says the Rosh Cirilio. So the Gemara is going to be continued and say that this phrase, "and it shall be thought," that the Torah is teaching specifically, says this Gemara, that Truma must be designated with thought and with intention. And that's a key idea here, doing mitzvahs with intention, and that there's a class of people who can take a legally significant act, but if they don't do it with intention, perhaps they didn't affect anything. So the Gemara says that it stands to reason with respect to any context where the term thought is written in the Torah, that one's action cannot demonstrate the validity of his intention. Rather, the intention must be valid on its own merit. So the Gemara says only with respect to a context where the term thought is not written can somebody's action demonstrate the validity of his intention. So in the case, says Amara Fulda, where the scripture explicitly mentions the requirement of thought, like in the Truma separation, the intention itself must be effective without the support of corroborating action. But by contrast, in other cases where scripture does not mention this requirement, like with hechsher, even though intelligent thought is necessary, it's enough for the thought to have be demonstrated with somebody's action. So in other words, if the person is putting up the fruit on top of the roof to dry out and becomes moistened by dew, the idea is that act now is a legally significant act, but it's also done with intention. Now, even if you don't know he did it with intention, the fact that he went and took that legally significant act shows there must have been intention there. But this is different with the separation of Truma. The idea here with the separation of Truma is that without the support of corroborating action, like in the case of putting the fruit on the roof, that you have to know that there was intention. Like you, when you're receiving it as a cone, have to know that, no, this person actually had intention when they separated it out. So it's not enough for the person just to take action, that you have to have knowledge that they did so. The Gemara says that here, in the context of Truma, the separation, since the term thought is written regarding it, one's action cannot demonstrate the validity of his intention. So it's because of this that the Truma designation of a mentally incompetent person is not valid. So even though he had the action of separating the correct Truma portion, that and that might look like it demonstrates the validity of his intent to separate out the Truma, it's not, because the idea here is that he's mentally incompetent, and the Torah uses the word thought, and they're not capable of thought in the same way. So hechsher, by the way, in contrast, is going to be affected primarily through a physical act, and then it becomes moistened, and this is going to be conditional upon the person's mental satisfaction with the moistening. And since hechsher is going to be primarily a physical matter, it's enough that the person took a physical act to do it. But over here, the separation of Truma is not necessarily just a physical act. It involves a consecration. So it has to be understanding that's linked to it. And again, the Torah uses the word thought over here in this kind of separation, but over there for hechsher or something like that, the word thought is not used over there. So the Gemara is going to look at this assertion that in any context in the Torah where the Torah does not specify thought, that it's going to be enough for somebody's action to demonstrate intention. And Rabbi Shmuel is going to say like this. He's going to say, or Rabbi Yossi says that I asked before, Shmuel, why consider the case of gittin? Those are going to be, by the way, documents for divorces, where it must be written for the sake of a specific woman being divorced. In other words, we see in the second gittin, that certain things that a scribe can't do. A scribe can't write many pre-written get documents to have like an inventory of gets, right? You can't do that. You have to be writing a get for a specific woman with a specific name in a specific place. So there has to be Kavanah when they're writing that document. You can't just take pre-written documents and then fill in the name. It doesn't work. So the Gemara says, why, let's look at the case in Gittin, and, where, these do have to be written for the sake of a specific woman being divorced. And the Gemara says the term thought is not written regarding Gittin. Yet the law is that somebody's action cannot demonstrate the validity of his intention. And we learned in the Mishnah that all are qualified to write a get, and even a deaf mute or a deranged person or a minor. Rabbi Kuna says that this permit for a mentally incompetent individual to write a get is applicable only when a competent person stands over him and instructs him to write it specifically for the man or the woman. And if, by the way, the mentally incompetent person writes a get by himself, it's not valid. Now, if he writes it on his own, he obviously includes the names of the husband and the wife and the location and the date. These, by the way, are important for every get. But that action demonstrates that he's actually writing it for the sake of the divorce. But the get is still not valid. So we see regarding Gittin that we cannot rely on somebody's action to demonstrate the validity of his intention. Rather, the intention must be valid on its own merit. And this is so that, even though the Torah does not mention the term thought in the term of context, that's still going to be the law. So unless, the husband has two wives with the same name, or there's going to be, two couples with identical names, the inclusion of the correct name and place and date looks like that the get was written for a specific divorce for a specific person. And it looks like this is written with intent for a specific thing. But again, it's not valid. Why? Because a mentally incompetent person cannot independently provide lishma, intent, when a get's being written. And when a competent individual stands over him and instructs him, this lishma, intent, is going to be present. And in that situation, the mentally incompetent person is going to contribute the physical act of writing. He's actually going to be writing in accordance with the intent of the competent person. And since that competent person instructs what to do, then the incompetent one follows the instructions without any independent thought. And that writing is deemed to have been done for the purpose imposed on him by a competent one, which, by the way, is lishma. So the word lishma is going to be that you have to have specific intent. And the Torah regarding gets is going to be derived from the verse in Beurim 24:1, where it says, "And he, the husband, writes for her a document of severance." And the word law is going to teach that the get must be written specifically for her sake. So although a get must be written with a specific intent of lishma and with a specific intent on that action, the Torah does not state the term thought regarding this requirement. It just says for her. And so the Gemara in part 2 of this year is going to develop this further and look more about get documents and this idea of intent and lishma. But part 1 of this year really is discussing this idea of Kavanah in terms of mitzvahs that do not have a purely physical element. There are mitzvahs that have a spiritual element. And so in terms of a get, you are separating a shidduch that Hashem brought, and that has a spiritual component to it, not just a physical act. Have a great day.